Pensar o passado para compreender o presente e idealizar o futuro. A filosofia de Heródoto ajuda a colocar em perspectiva a história dos Estados Unidos, marcada por disparidades raciais.
82% of American history is extreme racial oppression. 60% slavery, another 22% Jim Crow. Those were systemic and institutional racial oppression.
A gestão de Donald Trump aprofundou esse abismo social e fortaleceu o ideário da supremacia branca.
The center of the white frame, or worldview, is that white people are superior in every way. We whites are the hardest working. We whites are the most intelligent. We whites have the best civilization. We have the best legal system. We have the best democracy.
As reparações sociais são urgentes, sobretudo porque suas marcas são sentidas, inclusive na demografia atual dos Estados Unidos.
Some of the research that I do now looks at what's the legacy of the 1930s redlining, which were these maps that banks and mortgage companies used to determine in the 1930s who got access to low-cost mortgages and who didn't get access to that. So different kinds of benefits that were given. In some ways, those different policies helped to construct who was able to assimilate into whiteness, you know, the Italians, the Irish, the Germans, as compared to who was not able to assimilate at that point. So certainly looking at individuals of Asian American descent, Native American, African American descent. And so we can look at, you know, different immigration policies too, in terms of, you know, who was permitted to immigrate. So certainly I think white supremacy can take on many different forms.
Now we have a lot of illegal Canadians. We have a lot of illegal Israelis. We have a lot of illegal European immigrants. Nobody ever wants to send them home. Nobody ever talks about them as gangs and rapists.
Para resistir e existir, essa população historicamente inferiorizada pelo conceito da supremacia branca precisa se unir e se organizar politicamente.
It's that in states like California, when I was there as a professor, in the late 1960s, Ronald Reagan was governor, and it was a far right-wing state. White people ran the whole damn state from A to Z. And really far right, like Reagan, Ronald Reagan was governor. I had to sign a pledge as a professor, a junior professor. I had to sign a pledge I had never been a communist. We still had that kind of screening of faculty. I'd never been affiliated with a socialist group, any group that had any kind of socialist or communist agenda, right? And now California is probably the most liberal state. Why? Voters of color, and mainly Latin American, Latino, right? Voters of color.
Uma pesquisa conduzida pela agência Pew Research mostrou que 71% das pessoas não brancas nos Estados Unidos acreditam que as relações raciais são ruins no país, mas apenas 56% dos brancos concordam com essa afirmação. Essa diferença de percepção é um desafio histórico que a gestão de Joe Biden tem de lidar.
It is a challenge in terms of, you know, looking at how do you actually make systemic changes in something that is deeply rooted in white supremacy. White supremacy hasn't, it's still very prevalent. It just looks different than it has in the past. So I think oftentimes, especially many students will argue, you know, we no longer have separate watering fountains. We no longer have, individuals who, have to sit in the back of the bus. But unfortunately, we still have white supremacist policies and practices. We just code it in different ways. So we much more are more likely, especially in the U.S. context, to use colorblind language, where, students will say it doesn't matter if you're black, white, purple, polka dotted. We're all members of the human race. But in actuality, how most people will use colorblindness typically tends to be code for white. So oftentimes we can ignore race as long as you dress like me, you hold my values, you study my subjects, you pray like me.